Cody, get back to work!
It's the end of the series, boss. There's no more ads.
I said work!
Aww.
On May 22nd, 1990, nearly 5,000 friends, family, fans, and collaborators of the late Jim Henson gathered at the Cathedral Church of St. John the Divine in New York City to celebrate his life. It was the first of 2 memorials to be held for the creator, with the second being planned for London later that summer. An organist played the Sesame Street theme and Rainbow Connection as people strolled past photos of Jim and found their way to their seats. The service began with the Dirty Dozen brass band marching down the aisle, leading the clergy and the choir, followed by the memorial speakers and performers, and finally, Jane Henson and the 5 Henson children. After a song from the choir and a prayer, Richard Hunt approached the microphone, welcoming the nearly full cathedral to the 2-hour memorial. Backstage at the Muppet Theater, now repurposed into a television studio, Fozzie shouted at his fellow Muppets, telling them to prepare for the big production number. The cast was to put on a tribute for someone, although no one was quite sure who. It wasn't until Scooter burst into the room with a postcard from the group's leader, informing them that the production number was for a man named Jim Henson, although none of the Muppets could seem to remember who that was. Through the chaos and confusion, one thing was painfully apparent. Kermit was missing.
Hello there, my name is Jim Henson, and I'm a puppeteer. I'm called a puppeteer because I work with puppets.
Okay, you're gonna love this story. Greatest story in the world.
Hey, thank you, and welcome again to another Muppet Show.
On July 25, 1988, Jim Henson stepped onto the set of his brand new TV show, The Jim Henson Hour, to film the show's pilot. Jim had pitched a very vague program to NBC, in which he would host and a variety of things would happen. The only comparable to the type of program Jim was describing was The Wonderful World of Disney, Walt Disney's anthology series that had recently been given a new host, Disney CEO Michael Eisner. There were many things that Jim had proposed. One was lead-free TV, a segment satirizing cable television that had developed from an old pitch called Innertube. Each episode of the show was to have a celebrity guest star that would be trapped inside of the television, channel surfing from one program parody to another. Another thing Jim planned for the hour was technology demonstrations or behind the scenes at the Muppet Workshop and Creature Shop, a format taken directly from Walt Disney Presents. The show could also feature new Muppet segments and skits. Finally, the Jim Henson Hour would showcase episodes of The Storyteller, which NBC was threatening to cancel due to low ratings. The disjointed pitch Jim presented to NBC would have almost certainly never been greenlit without Henson and the Muppets' reputation in the industry. It seemed that the team knew this, as 2 minutes of the 12-minute pitch reel for the Jim Henson Hour was a montage of all of the things the team had done in the past. Jim attempted to organize all of the show's concepts into 4 different types of episode, with each type airing once per month. One week would be an episode of The Storyteller, another an episode of Lead-Free TV, another would be Jim's picture book specials, such as Emmett Otter's Jug Band Christmas or The Tale of the Bunny Picnic. And the 4th week would be left open for anything and everything Jim would come up with. Even with the ambitious attempts at organization, the Jim Henson Hour was random, and NBC's notes would just make it worse. Instead of the week-by-week change in programming that Jim had envisioned, NBC was asking that Jim combine all of the concepts into a single hour, with the first half hour dedicated to lead-free TV, skits, behind-the-scenes showcases, and celebrity guest stars, and the second half dedicated to The Storyteller or other specials. It would have been simpler if NBC had chosen a single idea, but the request for all of the concepts to coexist in a single hour resulted in a puzzle. Jim recruited his trusted team to develop the show, including writers Jerry Jewell and Jocelyn Stevenson, and producer Larry Merkin. They set out to put together the puzzle NBC had given them, but as Jewell would later admit, the pieces never really fit. Less than 2 years later, Jewell approached the microphone at Jim Henson's memorial. The first speaker after Hunt's introduction, Jewell would tell his favorite Jim story. While he was writing on The Muppet Show, Jewell and Jim attempted to fix a sketch that wasn't working, all centered around a painful pun.
Because I knew that if we lost that joke, we'd lose the whole sketch and I'd have to take off my coat and go back to work. And I said, Jim, is it this central joke that bothers you? And he laughed and he said, oh no, It's a terrible joke, but it's worthy of us. And that's the way I'll always remember Jim Henson, as a man who was balanced effortlessly and quite elegantly between the sacred and the silly. Thanks, Jim.
As the Muppets prepared for their tribute number, Scooter finished reading the postcard from Kermit. Kermit asked them to turn to the television to learn more about Jim Henson. After seeing his face, the Muppets remembered where they had seen him before.
I remember this Jim Henson fella. Oh, yeah? Yeah, he was always hanging around.
Where?
Down there.
Down there? What do you mean?
Yeah, see?
Wow.
Whoa.
Hey, who are those guys?
They then turned back to the monitor, where a montage of Henson's works began to play. Despite the team's anxiety concerning the format and style of the show, the filming of the pilot to the Jim Henson Hour, as was typical with most of Jim's sets, was fun and warm. The team that Jim had built over the past 3 decades had grown into a family of brilliant creative minds. Even with a questionable concept and format, originality of the content was never a concern. If anything, the Jim Henson Hour would create too many new things. Even excluding the show's second half, the first 30 minutes would be given a new cast of Muppet characters, most designed by Kirk Thatcher. Jim would regularly perform Kermit, Link Hogthrob, and appear on screen at the beginning and end of the show. Kermit would be put in charge of Muppet Television, a TV station run by the Muppets. Dave Goelz would perform Gonzo and a new character, Digit, Muppet Television's robotic technical director. Steve Whitmire would perform Bean Bunny and a new 3D animated character, Waldo C. Graphic, created to show off advancements in computer technology. Kevin Clash, a relatively new addition to the main group of Muppet performers, who had recently established the popular Sesame Street Muppet Elmo, would perform the new characters, Clifford, a relaxed, sunglass-wearing Muppet, and Leon, an inappropriate lizard. Performers Jerry Nelson, Fran Brill, Gord Robertson, and others would develop side characters, and longtime performers Frank Oz and Richard Hunt would make rare appearances. The show's director, Peter Harris, who Jim had worked with on The Muppet Show, suggested that in order to loosen Jim's performance up, he be given a side character to interact with. The Thought Lion, the impressive lion puppet built for the True Bride episode of The Storyteller, was chosen. The episode began with Jim introducing the program on a virtual set, before segueing to the Muppet television skits. These were chaotic and random, cutting between TV programs with the same speed and success of a college improv showcase. The pilot's Muppet television segment concluded with the cast singing La Bamba. The episode was originally supposed to be followed by a Storyteller episode, The Soldier in Death, but due to shuffling in its schedule, it would actually showcase Miss Piggy's Hollywood, a new Muppet special starring Miss Piggy. The show was a certified mess, and it was obvious. Jim attempted to ease the minds of network executives, explaining he knew there were some issues and was planning to fix them in the following episodes. He would continue to shoot the series into the fall of 1988 with his team of puppeteers. In May of 1990, that team of puppeteers had gathered again. Jerry Nelson and Louise Gold would perform When the River Meets the Sea, the duet that Paul Williams had wrote over a decade prior for Emmett Otter's Jug Band Christmas, and that had been performed by Robin and John Denver in The Muppets and John Denver, A Christmas Together. The song, which in the film mourns the passing of Emmett's father, took on new meaning as the performers sang the solemn ballad.
When the river meets the almighty sea.
After their performance, Allie Lou Curtin, representing the International Puppetry Association, UNIMA, spoke on Jim's contributions to the art, thanking him on behalf of all those that practice the craft. She was followed by British producer Duncan Kenworthy, who remembered Jim for his influence on countries throughout the world and how his work transcended borders. The Muppets continued to watch themselves in Jim Henson's productions, trying to get a better idea of who Jim was. Carol Burnett appeared on the screen, discussing the family aspect to the Muppets and their performers, before introducing another montage of Henson's works. On April 14, 1989, the first Jim Henson Hour premiered on NBC. It would not be the show's pilot, but instead an episode titled Outer Space, with guest star Louis Anderson. The second half would be an episode of The Storyteller, The Heartless Giant. The Storyteller segment, as with the rest of the series, received critical acclaim. On the other hand, the Muppet television segments were panned by critics. While many referred to them as lame or dull, some flat out despised the show's first half, deeming it a gross, unfunny modernization of The Muppet Show. Worse, the ratings were atrocious, and within a few weeks, the Jim Henson Hour would be one of the least, and possibly the least watched show airing in its time slot. While certain episodes, such as a May 5th episode featuring a film titled Dog City, would receive praise from critics, the show was slowly forgotten. In May, NBC decided to pull the show, airing the show's 9th episode, entitled Garbage, on July 30th, 1989, before canceling the Jim Henson Hour. The final 3 completed episodes, including a Muppets behind-the-scenes documentary, would eventually be aired on various networks and in varying forms in the coming years. The failure of the Jim Henson Hour was reminiscent of the rejected Muppet Show pilot, Sex and Violence. Both shows' humor, pacing, and characters missed the mark. The only difference is that the rejection of Sex and Violence resulted in Jim creating something far superior in the eyes of the audience, but with no one wanting to say no to the Jim Henson Hour, or Jim Henson. Its lackluster format and characters were dragged through multiple episodes. Experiencing commercial and critical failure in feature films had brought Jim back to television, and his love letter to the medium had been rejected just as Labyrinth had. Despite all of the high-tech graphics and advanced puppetry, the Jim Henson Hour was more Jim looking back on things that he had done than looking forward as he always had. The worst part in Jim's mind is that he had roped Kermit and friends into the failure, showing for the first time since the Muppet Show's premiere nearly 15 years prior that the frog was not invincible. All of these thoughts went through the mind of the 52-year-old creator, who had appeared to age rapidly over the past 5 years. His signature dark beard turned gray, and he was experiencing a myriad of aches and pains that made performing more difficult. The stress of running his company, finding funding for his projects, dealing with management issues, and experiencing the recent failures had become too much. Jim's mind was filled with 1,000 problems, but only one solution. He picked up the phone and called Michael Eisner. Harry Belafonte, who had created one of the Muppet Show's most memorable episodes and greatest numbers, had remained close to Henson after the production, often singing Jim's praises. Now, at the memorial, Belafonte would say a few words, emphasizing the gift Jim gave to the children of the world.
Many have no hope. Many mothers sit in many places holding their children, desperately understanding that they will never be educated. They will never have a chance at life as it should be. And when they get a chance to see the smile on the faces of their children as they develop the appetite to learn because they're watching Sesame Street, when they have developed the appetite to love in a loveless place because they have seen how friendly the Muppets and the creatures are to one another, when they find their own humanity and the humanity of these creations, then you'll have understood the real gift of Jim Henson and his colleagues.
Belafonte then sang the song that he had performed on The Muppet Show all the way back in 1978, in honor of Jim's vision of hope and unity. As he sang, the audience waved arm rods with butterflies on the end, created by the Muppet Workshop and passed out to those in attendance. This resulted in a passionate and powerful number, showcasing Jim's optimistic view of the world and humanity.
Oh, so is life about you, so is life.
In the Muppet Theater, Fozzie still didn't feel like he knew Jim well enough to do the tribute. Luckily, Clifford found a biography on Jim, and the Muppets gathered to watch a short retrospective on Jim's early creative works. In the spring of 1989, Jim approached Disney CEO Michael Eisner to discuss the possibility of selling his company to Disney. Eisner, who had greenlit Jim's Muppet Show pilots when he was working at ABC in the early 70s, was thrilled at the opportunity to bring Jim's now classic characters into the Walt Disney Company. Eisner, along with Disney President Frank Wells and Walt Disney Studios President Jeffrey Katzenberg, had been hired just 5 years prior to save Disney from takeover. Eisner had been doing his best to bring the Disney brand back into the mainstream, and a hit like the Muppets would be a surefire way to do so. For Jim, not having to worry about management, finances, or even distribution, all things he couldn't escape at his own company, would allow him to spend more time doing the thing he loved most, creating. Henson and Eisner shook hands, agreeing to pursue a deal in which Jim would sell his company and the Muppets, excluding the Sesame Street Muppets, to the Walt Disney Company. With the deal, Henson would also enter a 15-year exclusive contract with Disney, and would develop not only television shows and movies, but also theme park attractions. Theme parks excited Jim as much as anything else, as he loved Disneyland and Walt Disney World, admiring the Imagineers' attention to detail and world building. Creating content for a company as big and as strong as Disney, at the time, seemed like the best case scenario. News broke that a potential Disney Muppets deal was developing in the summer of 1989. In August, Jim flew to Orlando to meet with Eisner, Wells, and Katzenberg, and to tour the Walt Disney World Resort. He stayed at the luxurious Grand Floridian that had opened just a year prior, and visited Disney MGM Studios, which had opened a few months prior. The main negotiations took place at the newly opened Portobello Yacht Club and Pleasure Island at the Disney Village Marketplace. There, they would sign an agreement that would be the start of Jim's Disney deal. A few days later, on August 28, 1989, Jim appeared on Good Morning America with Eisner to announce their deal to the world. The Muppets were going to join the Walt Disney Company, and Jim was thrilled. Frank Oz's speech at Jim Henson's New York memorial would bring another story of Jim, with Oz describing an elaborate gift that Jim had given him for Christmas.
The quality of the gift and the craftsmanship, it all speaks so much of Jim, that gift. And I think the love, I think that's what I knew. He loved me and I loved him.
After Oz walked off stage, Rainbow Connection played through the speakers as the lights dimmed, spotlight shining on the large photos of Henson that had been placed throughout the cathedral. After the film of Jim's biography burned up, John Denver appeared on the screen, introducing a montage of Sesame Street moments and more scenes of Kermit and Friends.
You are Cookie Monster.
In September of 1989, Jim visited Walt Disney Imagineering in Glendale, California to discuss a potential Muppet section of Disney MGM Studios. Jim was planning a Muppet Studios area with a new 3D film, a live show with walk-around characters, and hopefully a ride that he and his team had brainstormed, the Great Muppet Movie Ride, a parody of Disney MGM's signature attraction, the Great Movie Ride. Jim was having a blast developing the attractions. Putting his creative energy in an entirely new medium was exciting, and the Imagineers were the same type of creators that he valued at his own company. Unfortunately, negotiations were getting more complicated between Henson Associates and Disney. Disney's lawyers were playing hardball, Katzenberg was being rude, and Eisner kept making casual remarks about acquiring the Sesame Street Muppets. Joining Disney seemed like a great idea in theory. Its simplicity was part of what made it attractive to Jim. It was turning out to be anything but. Negotiations continued into the fall of 1989, with Jim moving forward with his Muppet attractions despite the deal not being complete. In the end, it was still about creating for Jim, no matter how many meetings or phone calls about corporate logistics he was dragged into. The 3D film, named Muppet Vision 3D, would feature Kermit and the gang testing out the latest in 3D technology, with a lot of gags, a few skits, and even Sam Eagle's own A Salute to All Nations, but mostly America. A glorious 3-hour finale. The attraction prominently featured recent additions Bean Bunny and Waldo C. Graphic, along with the return of Frank Oz's characters, whose appearances with the Muppets had been sporadic as he pursued his directing career. The attraction would also feature elaborate lighting effects and animatronics of Bean Bunny, Statler and Waldorf, a penguin orchestra, and the Swedish Chef. A live Sweetums would even run out in front of audiences. The attraction was classic Muppet mayhem, and Kermit and Friends would be just as entertaining as ever. The film was planned to enter production in early 1990. In December 1989, Jim would perform Kermit the Frog in Disney's Christmas Day Parade, before celebrating the holidays with his friends and family. While the season was warm, 1989 was filled with stress and disappointment. The failure of the Jim Henson Hour and the stress of the Disney deal had made for a difficult year, on top of the fact that Jim had not been able to put a fourth Muppet feature into production. Jewel wrote a script for a film entitled The Cheapest Muppet Movie Ever Made, that Jim hoped to make in 1989, but he had never gotten around to it. The negotiations with Disney were taking up more and more of his time, frustrating considering they were intended to do the opposite. Producer David Laser attempted to keep peace between Disney and Henson Associates, while Eisner attempted to make up for Katzenberg's attitude. Still, Eisner couldn't help but ask again and again about the Sesame Street characters, and Jim was growing tired of it quickly. John Stone, the director of Sesame Street, would give a short speech on the love he had for Jim, and the love that all of those that worked together in his company had for each other. After this, a piano began to play the opening chords to Be in Green, the hit song that Kermit had first sang on Sesame Street 20 years prior. Then, almost out of nowhere, Big Bird walked onto the stage, wearing a Kermit green bow tie. Inside the puppet, Carol Spinney performed his character, singing Kermit's famous song, Fighting Back Tears.
It's beautiful, and I think it's what I want to be. Thank you, Kermit.
Jim's longtime agent and friend Bernie Brillstein walked up to the mic, emotional tension still in the air from Spinney's moving performance.
Jim told me never to follow the bird.
Brillstein could barely make it through his speech. The memorial, now over an hour in, was getting more difficult for the performers and speakers. After John Denver's montage, Ray Charles would also sing Being Green, with a montage of photos from Jim's life. 1990 would see the release of The Witches, a film based off of a book by Roald Dahl. Henson had produced the film in a similar capacity to the way his friend George Lucas had produced Labyrinth. The dark fantasy film would be well received by critics, but despised by Dahl, due to the film changing the original ending of his novel. Henson would attempt to calm Dahl, but the drama on The Witches was nothing compared to the Disney deal that Jim was focused on. As their lawyers continued to argue, Jim continued to create content for Disney, expecting the deal to go through soon enough, even with increasing tensions. Jim would shoot promos for Disney MGM Studios and the new stage show, Here Come the Muppets, as well as a special, The Muppets at Walt Disney World. The special saw the Muppets traveling to Kermit Swamp in Florida, only to find that it is right next to Walt Disney World Resort. The Muppets decide to explore Walt Disney World, and hijinks ensue. Michael Frith's speech at the memorial service would be filled with love for Henson, and even a few impressions of him.
This is Michael Frith, who sort of heads up one of our creative groups and sort of does a lot of our design stuff. It usually came as a kind of question, and for close to a couple of decades, it's been hanging there waiting for an answer.
After Frith, Jerry Nelson would read a tribute to Jim, in the voice of Electric Mayhem band member Floyd Pepper.
Fearless leader, green flippered gentleness. Fill my dreams with your vision of unexplored possibilities. Shine on eternally bright in our hearts and minds. Fearless leader.
Louise Gold would return to the stage, singing Bring Him Home from Les Mis, one of Jim's favorite musicals. After this, a priest read from scriptures of multiple religions. Jim was fascinated with different beliefs and researched many different systems throughout his life. The Muppets continued to watch the monitor as Steven Spielberg appeared, speaking on Jim's contributions to filmmaking technology. In the spring of 1990, Jim was flying from New York to Los Angeles to Orlando to London as casually as he always had. It seemed, in May, that he had picked up an illness, showing symptoms of a cold. On May 4th, 1990, an under-the-weather Jim traveled to Hollywood to appear with fellow performer Kevin Clash on the Arsenio Hall show.
An old piece of mosquito caught in your throat there.
Yes. I would have said I had a frog in my throat, but I won't say that. No.
Jim was disappointed in his performance of Kermit, not being able to keep up with Hall's wit, rambling on, and barely making the audience laugh. Clifford's appearance went well, but Jim could tell that his illness, which he still believed was just a cold, had affected his appearance on the show. Kermit was Jim's most famous creation, and he had appeared on almost every variety show on the air for as long as America could remember. And this would be the last time that he would, on Jim's arm. 2 days later, on May 6, 1990, the Muppets at Walt Disney World special would debut on NBC. The special, prominently featuring the classic Muppet Show gang, was as colorful and as fun as ever. The special ended with Mickey Mouse welcoming Kermit the Frog to the family, even though the Disney deal was not yet complete, and it would never be in its current form. It would take Disney another decade to finally acquire the Muppets after the events that would occur in the next 10 days. After the premiere of the Muppets at Walt Disney World, Jim Henson was still feeling sick. He had flown from Los Angeles to New York before flying to North Carolina to visit his father with his daughter Cheryl. He flew back to New York on May 13, 1990, feeling tired with a sore throat. His son John would visit that night, and Jim went to bed feeling even weaker. Jane had been informed that Jim was not feeling well and brought over a pot of soup. Jim asked her to stay, and Jane obliged. For the first time in the memorial, Jane and Jim's children spoke. Jane introduced the 5 Henson children before thanking many of the people that had made the memorial possible. Despite the frustration and the pain that had come of Jim and Jane's relationship in the latter part of his life, there was no doubt that Jane knew Jim better than almost anyone, proving it in her impromptu speech.
I don't want to pretend that I know what happens after this life, or that Jim really knew what would happen after this life, but he had great plans. And I sure hope somebody lets him know we're doing this down here, because he's probably pretty busy. On to the next. And I know sometimes, because everybody else was working, I would be used for interviews, and the press would ask me, did you ever have any idea that it would get this big? And what I didn't know is that it had gotten this big. I just didn't know.
After Jane, Cheryl and Brian read notes from Jim, some that they had received after his passing, written years before. One of the letters listed a few requests for his memorial, including that those in attendance refrain from wearing black, that Richard Hunt would host the service, that his friends might sing a few songs, and that a New Orleans jazz band would play. All requests that had been met.
Please watch out for each other and love and forgive everybody. It's a good life. Enjoy it. This all may sound silly and over the top to you guys, but what the hell, I'm gone and who can argue with me?
After Spielberg, Harry Belafonte would appear to tell the Muppets about Jim's impact on the world, followed by Frank Oz, explaining Jim's effect on the careers of the people that worked with him and the effect that the characters he created had on his audience. Jane stayed with Jim into the night, but Jim's condition was getting worse. His heart was beating fast, and he was coughing up blood. Jane told him he needed to go to the hospital, and early on May 15th, when the pain had become too much, he agreed. As the medical staff rushed him away, he waved to Jane, saying that he'd see her later. Through the rest of May 15th, the doctors attempted to save the life of Jim Henson, but they could not. He would pass away early on May 16th, 1990, at the age of 53.
There just never was enough time for Jim. There never would have been enough time. And I think he knew that really early.
In the years that followed, many would speculate whether it was Jim's Christian Science upbringing that had caused his untimely death, or the failures of Labyrinth and the Jim Henson Hour, or even the stress from the Disney deal. But the truth might be the hardest answer of all. It wasn't a fear of doctors, or failed projects, or tough negotiations that had killed Jim Henson. It was bacterial pneumonia. It is more difficult to grapple with the idea that a creator that put so much meaning and purpose into his work could pass away from something so random. But just because his death lacked purpose didn't mean there wasn't plenty in his great life. And before the shock could even wear off, those that he left behind were already making plans to celebrate that great life. Perhaps he had passed along some of his ridiculous optimism to those around him, but in the days following his death, his family was already at work. Using the request that Jim had wrote in his letters, Jane suggested that they do the same thing that Jim had done so well for so long, the thing that everyone close to him knew exactly how to do. They were going to put on a show. That first show at the Cathedral Church of St. John the Divine in New York City was drawing to a close in the afternoon of May 21st, 1990. At the end of the memorial, Richard Hunt returned to the stage, introducing Jim's team of puppeteers, including Frank Oz, Jerry Nelson, Kevin Clash, Dave Goelz, and Steve Whitmire, to sing some of Jim's favorite songs.
One of Jim's favorite times in any production was the musical pre-record session. We would have a great time. Right now, we'd like to share that moment with you as some of the Muppet performers sing some of Jim's favorite songs.
The first song they sang was the chicken version of Babyface from The Muppet Show. Then, Clash, as Elmo, sang Lydia the Tattooed Lady.
Lydia, oh Lydia, say have you met Lydia?
Lydia the Tattooed Lady.
Nelson would sing It's in Every One of Us from the John Denver specials and A Muppet Family Christmas. Oz and Hunt, using the voices of Fozzie and Scooter respectively, would sing a rendition of Simon Smith and his Dancing Bear, as they had done on The Muppet Show.
Oh, I'd step out in style with my sincere smile and my dancing bear. Outrageous. Aha! Alarmist it is. Courageous and charming. Yes.
Nelson, as Robin, would sing A.A. Milne's Halfway Down the Stairs, one of Jim's childhood favorites and the song that Nelson had popularized on The Muppet Show. Another one of Jim's favorite Milne numbers, Toddle Stand Pie, which he had performed as Rolf on The Muppet Show's first season, was performed by Oz in the voice of Fozzie.
Coddleston, Coddleston, Coddleston Pie. A fly can't bird, but a bird can fly.
Halfway through the song, Goelz, Clash, and Whitmire lifted Oz up in his chair, helping him get through the number. Goelz would perform Gonzo's I'm Going to Go Back There Someday, the powerful number from the Muppet movie. The song was given more depth, as the lyrics seemed to call to their lost leader.
I'm going to go back there someday.
The emotional song was followed by the much more light Wemblin' Fool from Fraggle Rock, performed by Nelson and Whitmire, reprising their roles of Gobo and Wembley respectively. Finally, the performers all came together to sing one of Jim's absolute favorites, You Are My Sunshine, which he had performed countless times over the years. Each song seemed to be given a stronger weight, as they all represented a different part of Jim's personality, whether it be humor, hope, or love.
Please don't take my sunshine away.
Back at the Muppet Theater, chaos returned after the Muppets finished learning of who Jim Henson was. The explosive production number tribute was barely coming together, as Fozzie attempted to do Kermit's job of keeping things running, although he wasn't nearly as good at it. It was obvious that they needed Kermit. While attempting to move a table, Fozzie found a folder of letters from Jim's fans, reading them aloud.
Dear Kermit, my cousin Diane has a pet frog and she named him Kermit. And he could say hi just like you.
Isn't that sweet?
Yeah,
That's really...
I feel very sorry that your best friend Jim died. What? Died? Jim
died? But we were just starting to get to know him.
Dear Kermit, I hope you feel better. I will miss Jim Henson too. I hope this letter makes you feel better. I love you. Bridget Kerwin, Peabody, Massachusetts.
We will miss you, Jim Henson.
Fozzie, realizing the number wouldn't do Jim justice, called it off. Everyone sulked away, and Fozzie didn't know what to do. It is easy to understand Fozzie's frustration. How can you pay tribute to someone as special as Jim Henson? He had taught the children of the world with Sesame Street, entertained the planet with The Muppet Show, and instilled valuable morals in the viewers of Fraggle Rock. He advanced the art of filmmaking with The Dark Crystal and Labyrinth, created incredible television shows such as Sam and Friends with no budget, and shows such as The Storyteller with a huge budget. Generations of children had grown up seeing Kermit the Frog on Sesame Street, Muppet Babies, The Muppet Show, and the Muppet movies, to the point that the world accepted the character as a celebrity. Jim trained hundreds of creators with a patient attitude, commanded film sets with a soft whisper, and kept the world's most influential people on the edge of their seat with a mere hum. Jim Henson was a brilliant, creative, hardworking, and talented person, but he was also one very important thing: lucky. He had the resources, he had the opportunities, and he had the privilege to pursue and obtain a life of creative success. He had more drive and talent than he knew what to do with, his internal ticking clock forcing him to produce as much as possible, but he also had a fair share of circumstance, and most importantly in his eyes, support. Jim was quick to acknowledge how fortunate he was to have a family of people throughout his life that encouraged him. But in the end, Jim believed that he and everyone else only needed just one person.
You know, this Jim Henson may be gone, but well, maybe he's still here, too, inside us, believing in us.
If just one person believes in you, deep enough and strong enough, believes in you.
All along the way, Jim was surrounded by support, people believing that he could succeed and encouraging him to do so, whether it was from a young age with his grandmother Dear, in college with Jane, in his career with Bernie Brillstein or Lord Lou Grade, or the countless others that recognized the spark of brilliance inside of him. And Jim passed it on, believing in Frank Oz to direct, believing in Dave Goelz to perform, and believing in practically everyone he met, because Jim believed that everyone had their own spark of brilliance inside of them. They just needed someone to believe in them.
And if, perchance, somewhere down the line, you see a child who, when you speak to him and ask him a question, he says, possibly, maybe, watch out, because there's more magic to come.
And if 3 whole people, why not 4? And if 4 whole people, why not more and more and more?
And as the puppeteers were joined by even more of their fellow performers, causing the crowd to jump to their feet, the power of Jim's belief was realized to its truest extent. Jim Henson, every performer on that stage, and all of their collaborators around the world had sent messages of joy, optimism, hope, friendship, and love into the homes of millions, if not billions, of people. They had all changed the world, just by wiggling some dolls. As the Muppets gathered to sing the same song of joy, the door to the theater opened, and in walked Kermit the Frog. It had been decided that Steve Whitmire would take over the beloved character, and after months of putting it off, he finally picked up Kermit. He then placed his fingers in the head and his thumb in the jaw, turning it to face him. What had been made by Jim over 3 decades prior, Whitmire and every puppeteer that would follow him would continue to give character. Kermit was alive, and so was Jim Henson.